Hey, good morning, everybody. Um, Purpose of this video is to kind of in just a handful of minutes go over and try to explain important content and ideas from chapter 24 about the Great Depression. Um, with us sort of moving forward, I am planning on you taking the chapter 24 test next week, next Friday. But I did want to actually just sort of lecture or cover the material verbally in some way. This is not going to be a long video. I'm not going to talk about all of the material from chapter 24. You don't have to take any notes, copy anything down. When you do take your test, you'll be allowed to use my notes, and they'll end up being sort of online, open note, open source tests. But I still wanted to take a day and explain some things. At the end of this video, I'm going to post a short quiz. I think it's 12 questions, which is going to be entirely based off of the notes. I expect that you should use the notes to take the quiz. Cheat your hearts out. Go online, Google stuff up, use Quizlet, use this video. For all I care, you can answer the questions while you watch the video. So just make sure that you take the quiz as well. So um, going through the notes, clearly I'm not going to go over everything. Um, so a little bit about this. Right before the Great Depression started, in the 1920s, the nickname of the time period was known as the Roaring Twenties because everybody was making money. There's tons of cash everywhere. Everybody felt that the economy was strong, but there were a lot of problems with the economy. Um, and through much of this section, I highlight a lot of those problems. One of the biggest problems was that people are using too much credit. They're borrowing too much money. They're going into too much debt, and then when people lost their jobs, they still had bills that they had to pay, but they didn't have any money, so that was one big problem. One of the biggest issues, and everybody talks about it, was the stock market crash at the time. That I don't have enough time to really fully explain what the stock market crash was, but pretty much a bunch of people invested money into businesses, prices were going up, and then just all of a sudden, over the course of a couple of days, boom, a bubble burst. A lot of people lost almost all of their money, and that was a big deal. A couple of important terms. You have bull market and bear market. A bull market is when stock prices are going up, people are making money. And a bear market is when stock prices are going down, people are losing money. Those are good possible test questions. Stock market crashes happened in October of 1929. There are actually two different stock market crashes. The first one was Black Thursday, October 24th, and then the next one was the week after on Tuesday. It was Tuesday, October 29th. That was called Black Tuesday. Um, Roughly about $30 billion was lost in 2 days in the United States, which was more money than we paid to fight World War One. So that was a ton of money to lose. And that pretty much kicks off the Great Depression. Um, there are a handful of other things that would sort of push this. As I said, rich investors losing money and not being able to pay off their loans. Average people started freaking out and like worrying, like if rich people are losing money, where's my money at? So people started rushing off to banks to try to pull as much money out as they can out of the bank and like just sort of have their cash. That's known as a bank run. Bank run is when banks just literally run out of cash. What might happen is one person runs to the bank, pulls all their money out. They tell their friends that they took all their money out. Their friends rush off to the bank, take their money out. Before you know it, everyone's going to the bank, pulling their money out, and banks literally run out of cash. This forced a lot of banks to close, and that's not a good thing for the economy when banks have to close. Thousands of banks in the early 1930s were forced to close because of this. Because consumers, like average people, had less money, they spent less money, businesses started shutting down, unemployment grew, and unemployment was massive. In 1929, 23% of American workers were unemployed. 3 years later, in 1932, 23% of American workers were unemployed. We're seeing that right now. Before all this COVID stuff was going on, unemployment was about 3% in America just this year. Last week, while we don't have solid numbers yet, so many people in America right now have lost their jobs that it's being estimated that unemployment might be upwards of 25% in America today. So, um, 1 out of 4 American workers lost their jobs at the beginning of the Great Depression. Um, I'm not going to kind of go over this entire section here. A little bit about the Dust Bowl. We kind of got hit with some bad luck. Farmers were over farming, and there was a massive drought in the Midwest. It would actually uh, create the nickname the Dust Bowl for the entire Midwest portion of the country because there would be so little rain, so much over farming that there'd be like actual dust clouds that would form in the air and sort of spread along the countryside, and that was a big deal. So that's kind of bad luck there. Um, as I said, people are using too much credit. There was a huge gap between the rich and the poor. The rich were really rich, and the poor were really poor. And I talked about this way back in the World War One section or World War One chapter. The global economy was destroyed from World War One, and we talked about how the Allied powers sort of blamed Germany for causing World War One and made them pay $33 billion in reparations. Germany never recovered from that. They ended up just printing off money to try to pay off their debts, and that ruined their economy, which then sort of had this ripple effect through all of Europe, and it ruined the entire European economy. And eventually, that did make its way to America. So, Germany's economy was a huge problem. Moving on to this section here, I'm not gonna like talk about any of this because it's mostly just statistics. Talk about how hard it was to find a job during the Great Depression. As I said, tons of unemployment. Um, this slide here talks about the issues of homelessness. If you want to, these videos are great. They talk about being poor and trying to get food through a soup line. People living in Hoovervilles. The president at the time was President Herbert Hoover. He was so hated by Americans during this Great Depression. I'm going to talk about that in a future slide. That homeless people that were setting up sort of makeshift towns and villages with tents and whatnot, they were nicknaming those towns Hoovervilles in honor of President Herbert Hoover because they blamed him for all of their problems. People typically blame the president when things go bad. Um, I'm not going to kind of go over the farm section. You guys can read that if you end up needing that for the test. Marriage rates on this slide here. We talked about how marriage rates and birth rates are declining. People were nervous about getting married and having children during the Depression, so you actually started seeing people getting married less and having less children. I got this note here about how there was more alcoholism. People were drinking more during the Great Depression, which led to alcohol abuse, and that was a real problem. And there's this note about increased domestic violence. It was a sad side effect that when people lose their jobs and alcoholism becomes a problem, there's more violence in the home. There were more reported cases of that. This slide here just looks at sort of how we started looking at professional sports like baseball and boxing to sort of distract us. I'm not going to spend any time here on that. Here's a little bit about Herbert Hoover. I did want to kind of finish off with him just quickly. Um, President Hoover was highly unpopular during the Great Depression. He was just sort of unlucky. He didn't do anything in particular to cause the Great Depression. His issue was how he responded to the Great Depression. He, quite frankly, he would like to use the term rugged individualism. This term here. It was the idea that, quite frankly, if you were poor and homeless, that's going to make you tougher. It's going to make you build character. Um, and that, quite frankly, if you don't want to be poor, you'll work harder. I always like to use the phrase rub some dirt on it. If you're hurting, rub some dirt on it. Work harder. Get to work. Do your thing. And quite frankly, there's only one person responsible for your success. It is you. That was Herbert Hoover's opinion. He did not believe that the government should be helping anyone. He felt that, quite frankly, if you were poor, it was your fault. And only you can get yourself out of poverty. If you were poor and you were working hard, you hated this man because he was the guy who was showing no sympathy and did not seem to show that he felt bad about the problems that people were going through. So Herbert Hoover is a public enemy number one at the time. I'm not going to go over this slide here. In the one video I posted here, it's about the Hoover Dam. The government did try to hire people to like create public works programs. So I mean, this might be worth your time watching a little bit later. I do want to point out this bonus army. Another reason Hoover was so hated was the way he treated America's veterans. This bonus army was a group of 10,000 World War One veterans that in May of 1932 had marched to Washington, D.C. because they wanted to be paid early bonuses that they were promised for fighting in World War One. They felt that it was extraordinary times and that they needed cash, so they marched on DC. America loves its veterans. We always have. We've always treated them with respect and honor and dignity. And these are men that fought for our freedom in World War One. President Hoover's reaction was he ordered the U.S. Army to go into their camps and bust up their camps and bust up their marches, which led to the arrest of hundreds of veterans and killed 3 people. Hundreds were hurt, and of the 3 killed, one of them was an 11-week-old baby. And while it wasn't Hoover who did it, like he's not the one who went in himself and did it, he ordered it. This appalled people. It angered people, and quite frankly, he was done as president of the United States because just a few months later he would run for re-election against this guy here, President Franklin Roosevelt, which you will learn about a lot more in the next chapter. He is the guy who is going to end the Great Depression. He runs against Herbert Hoover as a Democrat and just absolutely destroys Herbert Hoover. If you look at this electoral college map down here, um, Franklin Roosevelt won pretty much every state in the country with the exception of a few, Pennsylvania being one of them. We apparently, Pennsylvania loved Herbert Hoover. So that's about it for the notes. I know I rushed through it really, really quickly. I just didn't want to take too much of your time here. Use my notes, use the video, use your online sources, take the short little quiz that is posted along with this video. All right, thanks. See ya.